It's now time for question and answer session. If I can ask you to raise your hands, Cindy and Esther will have the roving microphones. Introduce yourself and the organisation that you represent. If we can start off with Fiona.
Yes, Fiona McNabb again. I'm actually, I am associated with a notorious person in this incident. Andrew from Officer, who you may remember a few weeks ago, rang up Neil Mitchell and said that Abbott must go. He's my cousin Andrew McNabb. And he is in fact very, very involved with the Liberal Party, and he was at that time. I haven't spoken to him about it lately, but he was strongly of the view that Abbott's going to go, and I just want your views on that.
Ben.
Well, I think he is likely to go. I'm not 100% certain, but I thought the last time there was a push for a challenge, he was given, he and Hockey, because they're kind of a team, were given at least until the budget to sort themselves out. Now there seems to be all this extra activity going on today as we speak about getting up another challenge and numbers marshalling for Turnbull, which is a consequence of the way they chose to attack the Human Rights Commissioner over her organisation's report on children in detention. I think that was probably seen by a lot of people in the party, even if you did think there was some valid ground for criticising the way she kept her powder dry during the term of the last government. I think it was probably seen as a little bit playing the woman, let alone the man, and not a very impressive thing, and not a good way to sort of reset the government after multiple resolutions to do so. So I still think they will give him to the budget. I don't think it makes sense to come to that conclusion 3 weeks ago and then suddenly have a dummy spit over what is obviously a political miscalculation this week and change your mind. So that's my view. And after that, if the budget is not a success and isn't well sold, then I think there's probably a chance of that Tony Abbott won't be the Prime Minister by the end of the year. And that's in fact what the betting markets say, and that's supposed to be where the smart money is. Thanks.
Questions from Table 5 first, then Table 1.
John Allen, self-employed consultant. Incidentally, 33 years ago I attended my first political and economic overview at CEDA, and the other description is political voyeur. Ben, I loved your 40-year trend, single government. Never seen it described like that, 1970s, 1930s, 2010s. I wonder if I could ask a question of each of you to comment on the two election results that have gone against that trend in the last 6 months. John Key in New Zealand for you, Ben, and Jay Weatherall for you in South Australia. Josh?
You can go first.
I think the result in South Australia was very interesting, as was the result in Queensland that we saw more recently. There's a lot of debate in the Liberal Party at the moment about, a lot of debate in the broader community about the extent to which there was an Abbott factor involved in those two elections. And again, there will be a lot of debate in the context of the New South Wales election as well. I think there undoubtedly was an Abbott factor at play, particularly in a state like South Australia where there's a traditional manufacturing base. And we're sort of seeing, Ben spoke about this, but we're seeing the debate about the submarine contracts playing out at the moment, which is an issue that's very well, South Australians are very aware of that sort of issue, and that was kind of quite poignant politically there. In Queensland as well, there was a lot of debate, as I'm sure you all know, about privatisation of assets and asset sales, which I agreed with what Ben said. I think there's not that much evidence that privatisations cause problems for consumers, and it's probably helped the broader community. Nevertheless, it was seen as a big political negative for Campbell Newman in South Australia. So I think Abbott has, and certainly in Victoria, Abbott created a difficult situation for Dennis Napthine. I mean, there was that moment during the campaign where, or it was just before the campaign, where Tony Abbott came to Melbourne and tried to hug Dennis Napthine, and I thought you could sort of almost see Napthine's head trying to recoil into a shell like a turtle a little bit. So, you know, in South Australia, it was, you know, they campaigned against Abbott, and in Queensland, Labor campaigned against Abbott and tried to link Abbott to Campbell Newman. So I think it is powerful politics, and you know, and also I think voters are uncomfortable about the idea of having the same political brand at different tiers of government. They do like a contrast, and you see that over time. As you know, you can have all of one particular type of government at the state and federal levels, and then voters like to mix things up a little bit, and I think there's an element of that going on as well.
Thanks for the question, John. When I put up that construct before, I didn't mean to let poor leaders off for their poor leadership, and I think you know, good leaders can still prevail in these kind of circumstances because people, you know, if they can show a streak of independence from the 24/7 media cycle and from the prevailing, you know, conventional wisdom about what's politically wise and what you need to do to hang on to government as opposed to govern well, which can be two different things, I think they can survive. So John Key to me is just an example of that, somebody who's a relatively impressive leader. New Zealand is also a place where you know, it's a small open economy. They know no one's there to do them any favours, and they really, you know, it seems to me they know they have to be as competitive as they can be, and you can see it with their dairy industry. And I think John Key is just, you know, a fairly impressive leader, probably more impressive than much of the crop we've got here. That's what I think explains that. And I think another one I didn't mention earlier would be Angela Merkel, who's survived for 10 years as Prime Minister of Germany through, I think, several iterations of coalitions. But, you know, she's obviously somebody, she's a quintessential German pragmatic politician, and people obviously in Germany respond to her, even if she's, you know, not, wouldn't appear to be your favourite auntie. She's impressive, and just on Weatherall, I think what I would add to Josh's very good summary of Weatherall is that South Australia is also, you know, it's a small, vulnerable economy where, and they can see themselves losing the car industry and not getting the Olympic Dam expansion going. And, you know, they can, you know, I think Jay Weatherall has kind of seen the future, and he doesn't want to be the leader of Spain, and you know, even though they've survived so long, he doesn't want to be out next time. So even before, you know, for example, he announced an inquiry into potentially expanding the state's nuclear industry. That's pretty well heresy for a Labor leader, and most coalition leaders don't want to go there because it's whenever they do, they get slaughtered. So I think you've got to give him credit for that. But even before that, I think he was starting to outline some, you know, seemed prepared to kind of slay a few of Labor's sacred cows on finding new ways to generate growth in a state which hasn't got as many opportunities as some of the larger states. And I think Mike Baird in New South Wales is also an impressive leader. And so even though he's challenged by the Abbott factor and by the anti-privatisation push, you know, I think there's a reasonable chance that he may survive, although I wouldn't bet my house on it. So, thanks for the question.
Darren Grimsey from EY. Like the previous question, Ben, I very much liked your history lesson. I thought what it did was it reminded me anyway that human memory is short, and consequently we tend to be more in a cyclical environment than perhaps a linear environment, and so trends come round. But I also reflected that, you know, from an economic point of view, we're always mindful to look at history but not think of history as necessarily a good predictor of the future. And I looked at those periods in history, and I thought to myself, well, you know, to what extent was the population perhaps more partisan, more aligned to political parties, more rusted on from a structural point of view because of the labour markets or because of world events, even going back to the war periods. So what I'm interested in from you as media commentators is to shift it round from perhaps the politics as of the individuals and the parties to the politics of the electorate. And what are you seeing within the electorate which might signify, structural changes which would knock us out of that cyclical nature of the politics? And what, as a consequence of that, do you think that there is a need for electoral reform? And here, of course, I'm referring to what Josh has pointed to, and we know at the federal level has been a consequence, the rise of the independent and the minority and the level of strength that they are now exerting on the political system.
Just quickly, I think what you're talking about in the political, I think there's no doubt that people are less rusted on the political parties, but they are also less rusted onto large centralised institutions in every sphere of our economy and society. So it's political parties, it's large companies no longer have, except in areas where you actually need to build and control a very large piece of infrastructure, like a mining company or a transport company of some kind. Large centralised organisations no longer have the purchase on the consumer or the voter that they used to have. And they're struggling to deal with that reality, whether they're political parties or whether they're established taxi industries or established hotel chains. They find these app-based digital networks sort of growing up around them that are very hard to sort of grapple with, and hard for governments to get a handle on how to regulate. There's no chairman to tap on the shoulder and say, come in for a talk. So I think it is a real challenge for it's not just for politicians, it's for business lobbies, to take another example. Seems to me the old model of the Business Council or the Chambers of Commerce getting up getting an accounting firm or a consultant to do a report for them on some issue, energy markets, tax, whatever you like, and taking it to Canberra and launching it and giving an exclusive to the Australian Financial Review or some other media outlet to publish it, no longer has the same impact that it had in the 80s when Bob Hawke was able to call together all the sort of big pillars of the sort of corporate state, if you like, the unions, the big business and the politicians, and sort of map out a plan for 10 or 20 years. I'll hand over to Josh, because I haven't got the solution, except that something is happening at the grassroots level that these clumsy, slow-moving, large, centralised organisations struggle to grapple with.
I don't have the solution either, Ben, but I think one interesting phenomenon that's been building momentum for a long time now is that there's a whole lot of aspects of society that are much more dynamic than they used to be. I think the flow of ideas is much more fluid. So, you talk about the 24-hour news cycle. Governments have a lot more trouble controlling the media cycle now. So the old model was that you might, selectively brief a particular news outlet, you'd get a screaming headline, and then you could control the media cycle for a full day. Nowadays, as soon as something hits people's screens, there's people tweeting about it, there's people on Facebook, other news outlets get it up online, everyone's commenting on it. Governments have much less control over these things. So I think people are sort of, and I think this is a very good thing, but I think people are much more susceptible to different ideas coming from a whole lot of range of different areas. I think also demographically things are a bit more fluid as well. We're experiencing rapid population growth. Melbourne is growing by about 1,600 or 1,700 people every week, and there's a lot of population growth, in the west. Bits of Melbourne are absolutely booming, and the old sort of thing about people staying in their houses and jobs applies less. So it's more difficult in a sense for political parties to work out what issues are important to different groups of voters, and often they adopt a sort of more of a scattergun approach to try and deal with that, I think. And you know, and then people think, oh, well, that the sort of policy pronouncements lack coherence in a way which also makes it both sides of politics less distinctive in some ways. And the other related thing is, I think political parties are trying to be more and more sophisticated about working out what particular groups of voters want. So they use these very fine-grained polling techniques, you know, and that means they try to really target voters on particular, you know, quite micro issues often, particularly in state politics. You know, there might be a sporting field or a new park or something like that, but it gives you less of a sense of what an overarching political party is about. And in a sense, you've just got this race where both major parties are kind of converging in the middle. It's that ice cream stand theory of politics Harold Hotelling came up with about why businesses cluster together. And I think that applies to politics as well in quite an interesting way. So I don't think that's answered your question at all, but I think there's some interesting dynamics going on.
Thank you, Josh. A question from David down the front.
Thanks very much. I wonder whether the key to a lot of what you're talking about now is around understanding of the dynamics of what's happening at the grassroots. If I could take a couple of concrete examples. If you take the state government has announced that they propose to cap local government rates. Now, the immediate response from many of the local government authorities is we will cut services. In local communities where the rates are already very high, that's leading to a question, well, what are the services that are being delivered? What does it mean to cut services? Does it mean cutting the collection of rubbish? Does it mean dealing with the fact that the roads are falling apart? There are myriad examples where local authority actually undertakes specific responsibilities that impact very directly with Joe Blow at the grassroots level. And to simply say you're going to cap the level at which rates are increasing, if you look at Gippsland, for example, the level of rates there are significantly higher than they are here in Melbourne, and yet the pattern of services is significantly less. You've also got things like the Beltway agendas around, for example, energy policy, where you've got a situation in which the energy companies are selling energy offshore, and that translates into higher consumer energy costs at the domestic level. That actually impacts on the direct budget that individuals have to carry. You've got the wider questions that came up with the last federal budget around health services, GP co-payment. The core issue there is families are asking, how do we put our budget together when taking the kids to the doctor is really going to cost us? In short, what you're getting is a scenario where at the grassroots level, a lot of people are hurting. A lot of people are being hurt by policy positions that might theoretically appear to add up, but at the practical level they impact in a way that causes people to hit back. I suggest that might be why we're seeing the incidence of one-term governments becoming again quite pervasive. It's no accident that you look at the period of the Depression, for example, and you had a period of single-term governments. The same thing could well be occurring now. The underlying dynamic is really hurting people.
Yeah, I mean, just on that issue of council rates, I think that's a really, really interesting point. In fact, I was reading a briefing note that Standard & Poor's, the ratings agency, put out it was either yesterday or the day before, warning that that policy would lead to a mismatch between the council's ability to raise revenue and their spending requirements, because part of the problem with government is that voters have very high expectations of what can be delivered, but at the same time they don't necessarily always want to pay up, and voters aren't very good at connecting the two things. You know, they just want services, but they don't want to spend the money to provide it. And as you point out, there's a lot of concern in councils that this policy will curtail their ability to raise revenue and lead to an erosion of services. And indeed, that's what that Standard & Poor's briefing said. It said it will curtail their ability to maintain infrastructure and that sort of thing. So, but I think sort of beyond that, and this goes back to the last question as well, voters are very concerned with cost of living pressures as well. And, you know, I mean, it's interesting because we are becoming more prosperous, but people feel like they're under more and more pressure. And they sort of, I think we've had this long period of prosperity, you know, all through the mining boom, and there's a whole generation of voters that aren't really used to this idea that, you know, things can sort of get tough in a way. They're used to governments just providing services, and, you know, energy prices is a big issue. Companies are exporting, you know, it's a big issue in natural gas. I think that they're selling a lot of natural gas overseas, which could impact on the domestic market. And that fed into the coal seam gas debate here as well. So that's sort of feeding back into local politics a bit. But I think these issues are very difficult to grapple with. And yes, consumers, you know, want better services. They don't want to pay as much for them, and they want governments to be competent in delivering them. And governments are sort of trying to be all things to all people and make big promises about fiscal austerity. You know, we'll increase spending, we'll you know, basically do mutually conflicting things, and I think it's very difficult for governments to deliver that.
Gas reservation was another opportunity for special pleading I was going to mention. I think the Australian Workers' Union is running a campaign. Some large manufacturers are still pursuing it. I think it was led a few years ago by Dow Chemical in Australia, but they seem to have dropped off reservation. Personally, I don't think it will help. It hasn't constrained prices in Western Australia, where I think 15% of production is reserved for local consumption. But I think it's an obvious example of, you know, if the Abbott government is looking for retail politics, ways in which it can try and shore up its standing, regardless of whether those policies make sense in a practical way. There may be a greater chance that will eventuate. At a broader level, what you described is that, you know, governments always try and push the pain down a tier. So if you're the federal government, then and you're struggling with making ends meet, you push the pain down to the states. If you're a state government and you can see you're going to be struggling to make ends meet, you push the pain down to the local level. Those local ratepayers do have, I mean, if in Gippsland they can't see value for money in their rates, they do have the opportunity to vote, I think, in local elections annually. So there is a mechanism to get rid of local governments or change the policies. Query whether people are really motivated sufficiently to do that. But more broadly, you know, whether it's the 30s or the 70s or the current period, national income has been curtailed, and after a long period of rising prosperity, and governments do have to cut their cloth. They've got to make choices. Whether they've made them skillfully or not is another debate, but they do have to make choices about where the money goes, and that's going to affect households. So yeah, I agree with you, that's part of the reason why we're seeing short-term governments, but it is a fact that we've had a cut in national income. We don't know how long it's going to go on for, but, you know, commodity prices don't look as though they're kind of going north anytime soon. So we're going to be in this situation for a little while yet, and those pressures will continue, I think. Thanks.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question.
Thanks. If we look at the two leaders you talked to about who have been successful, Baird and Key, they're both people with deep knowledge of economics and finance. Is it really necessary now for leaders to actually understand more deeply the drivers and what's going on? That people like Julia Gillard, who were lawyers and saw a new law or a new regulation as a solution to everything, have struggled. I just wonder whether it's easier to maintain a narrative if you've got the right sort of... Anyway, I'll leave it there. Any thoughts?
Just really quickly, I think people are quite sick of glib pronouncements in politics. And, you know, we're getting a lot of those sorts of 5-word slogans from our politicians. I think people are starting to want more. Starting to want more information, a more sophisticated debate, and a bigger sort of demonstration that politicians do understand how things really work and an ability to explain it to people. And I think an understanding of economics and finance is very important. I think that's something that is a weakness for Tony Abbott, that he's not great in that area. In fact, I think Peter Costello said that what did he say, Ben? He said he hated economics or something once, some time ago. So I think you're right. I think it is increasingly important.
I hadn't thought of that as an opportunity to sell more places in university economics courses, Rodney. But I would point out that I think Curtin was a journalist, Menzies was a lawyer, obviously. Thatcher was a chemist, and Keating is considered a very successful treasurer, was manager of a band, I think, after he left school. So, but I think the thing you've really got to have is an open, inquiring and agile mind, and Keating learned it all from his Treasury advisors, and he might have been a bit clunky at the outset, but he was obviously a quick study. And he became one of our most successful treasurers. So not trying to downplay the importance of economics and finance, although I didn't study it formally, but I don't think it's an absolute prerequisite for successful leadership.
Well, thank you. We might wrap up the session there. Thank you so much.